Hello and welcome to the Washington, D.C. update. This is a webinar of the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. We're talking about federal government policy developments here at the very beginning of 2024. So Happy New Year, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. I am Caitlin Sickles. I'm a senior principal at the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. Also on the webinar today is Paul Nathanson from Bracewell. We do the strategic communications for NTMA and PMA. The team from the Franklin Partnership is on the webinar as well today. That's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. They do the on-the-ground lobbying for NTMA and PMA here in DC. We have a nearly record high registration for today's webinar, which is very exciting, possibly a reflection of New Year's resolutions from participants to tune in to what's going on in Washington, or perhaps it is a simple awareness that an election is nearly upon us and people had better start tuning in lest they are only overwhelmed by political ads on TV. Today on the webinar, we have a lot of content to cover. We'll talk about what's going on in Congress. We'll give a regulatory update. We'll give an update on what the latest is in tax policy, as well as trade and supply chain updates. Before we get to any of that, though, I want to just remind participants on the webinar to also participate in our One Voice survey. If you don't know what the One Voice survey is, every year we survey members of NTMA and PMA about issues that are impacting manufacturers. So questions are about everything from how your company is structured to how you might make investments in R&D, what you're thinking about in terms of workforce. All of that is really important because we use those survey results to inform the top policy issues that we focus on throughout the year. And we also use it as key data points with members of Congress and members of the media. So that survey is really an important tool for your representatives here on the webinar to advocate for small and medium-sized manufacturers in Washington, D.C. You can see on this slide how many people have participated in the survey so far. We have about 1,600 people who have received the survey, about 58 companies who have completed. That is not quite where we'd like to be from a participation rate. We need that number to be a little bit higher so that the results will be statistically significant and we can use it as a representation of NTMA and PMA members. So please do look for that survey within your company. You would have last received it on Wednesday this week. It will go back out to companies again next week, but do look for that survey. If you have not received the survey and you think, I'd love to participate, but I don't know how to track it down, please reach out to PMA, NTMA, or the folks who are leading this webinar today and ask us to send that survey to you, and we will make sure that you get it. With that,
Caitlin, you brought up a good point of the importance of this survey. Is we are known on Capitol Hill and within the administration as people who provide data. We just don't use talking points to persuade policymakers to move one way or the other on particular issues that we're working on, whether it's the R&D tax credit, 100% expensing, the apprenticeship programs, and issues like that. So we take this survey, and yes, it's a very long survey, but we break out small parts of it and then provide data to policymakers to say, this is the impact of not extending the R&D tax credit, on NTMA and PMA members. As Caitlin says, right now we've got 58 responses already in. We really need that number we'd like that number to be over 100, which would represent roughly 6-7% of the membership of NTMA and PMA. And so if you haven't filled out the survey, we really do hope you will find who in your shop has received that copy of that survey and complete that survey right away. So
Yeah, that's great.
moving on, yep. Moving on to what's going on in Congress, what happened? So before Congress broke for the holidays, it was a very busy December. Congress passed the National Defense Authorization. They passed a short-term extension of the FAA reauthorization. But then there's a number of things that didn't happen. They did not pass a war supplemental to provide funding for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. The White House was hoping to include border security uh, uh, language in that war supplemental, and negotiations between the White House and the Senate fell apart. Furthermore, complicating factors is you had the House Republicans who no longer want border security legislation attached to the war supplemental. They would rather instead attach it to government funding, and so they are threatening to shut down government if the Congress doesn't agree to, and the White House doesn't agree to some sort of border funding legislation. They did pass a House committee, Education and Workforce Committee, did pass a bipartisan Workforce Investment Opportunity Act reauthorization, WIOA. The key word there is bipartisan, and we hope as the legislation moves through the process in the House of Representatives that it does remain bipartisan. But probably the biggest shortfall is the legislative leaders did not come to an agreement on what is the top line spending levels for government. As we've mentioned on previous webinars, Congress is woefully behind in passing their appropriations bills, but one of the reasons is they haven't determined what that top line number is that the government can spend in any given fiscal year. And so that leads to just what's going to turn out to be a crazy January. Starting on January 9th, Congress passed a continuing resolution to keep government funded for two different dates. One is January 9th, one is February 2nd. 20% of government funding runs out on January 19th. Keep in mind, Congress is not in session this week. So government funding for the Department of Agriculture, Food and Drug Administration, Energy and Water, military construction, VA, HUD, and transportation runs out on January 19th, not that far away. And even just a little farther beyond that, 80% of government funding runs out on February 2nd. And those are some of the big agencies: Department of Commerce, Justice, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Education, Labor and Health and Human Services. And so Congress does have their work cut out for them with such a short time frame. One thing that people are starting to talk about is, will they keep the government funding, do a continuing resolution at last year's funding levels till September 30th of this year? That resolves one issue, the pressing issue of passing appropriations bills, but many of the House conservatives, the House Freedom Caucus, don't want to spend at last year's levels. They think last year's levels will be bloated, and that is what eventually led to the downfall of Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So stay tuned on that. As we've mentioned over many webinars, is the R&D 100% expensing, 163J business loan deductibility. The House Ways and Means Committee passed a partisan bill for tax provisions, and now we're waiting to see what those next steps are. They did not pass this tax bill by the end of last year, but discussions between House Republicans and Senate Democrats are continuing, and so there is some optimism there. In addition, there's a number of temporary tax provisions that are expiring, or a number of expiring tax provisions. So the Congress is likely going to have to pass a tax extenders. The House Ways and Means Committee is expected to take up a tax extender package sometime in February and March. There are some in the Congress who say that if we pass a tax bill that would include that R&D fix that is so important to PMA and NTMA members, that there must be some revenue raisers, some offsets so it doesn't have such a dramatic impact on the federal budget deficit. That's going to be another stumbling point moving forward. But needless to say, there's growing pressure. It's not just the R&D tax credit, 100% expensing of 163J. There's now a number of other expiring tax provisions that the Congress needs to address. So, but
Yeah,
Omar,
and no, I think you're right there, John. A few things that we're hearing there to put some further color on the timing here. The reason the slide says possible in the first half of 2024 is because we're trying to at least try to be on the side of caution here, especially after last year's start and stops. What we are hearing is that we should see in the next 2 weeks or so the text of a legislation, or at least the outlines of a bipartisan agreement between the House and the Senate with tax provisions in there, including a fix for the research and development to Section 174. That is really critical and the top lobbying priority on Capitol Hill right now for both NTMA and PMA. Along with that, as John mentioned, would include some other things. But as to the timing, if they were to release something in the next couple of weeks, then we have to start figuring out how it gets moved. To John's point, the committee would like to make some progress and get the bill through their process here by February. There are some calculations to look into. What would it hitch a ride onto? There's concern, as the slide says, about whether or not to attach it to the government spending bills, because those are already so big as they are, and there's a lot of uncertainty associated with them. The hope is to try to get the tax package done with enough time for the IRS to be able to factor in to their computers and into their software all the different retroactive filings that are going to have to be done. So all the refilings rather. And then since 2022 is the retroactive date for the R&D that we're targeting, that would also create complications, especially for us pass-throughs that are out there in the world. So keep in mind that there's still a lot of uncertainty here. Talk to your tax practitioners, especially as you're getting after your January 31st timeframe when you start getting your forms from your accountants in terms of what can be done to buy you so a little bit extra time if you can here into maybe March, as John said, where we hopefully can get there. But we are pretty confident that we might see something here in the next 2 weeks with regards to a tax package. It would still need to move through both chambers, still need to hitch a ride and still overcome a lot of issues. But we've always said this is a two-step process. Come to agreement what's in the package and then figure out a way to move the package. So we are making progress. And so appreciate everyone sticking with us. I think John captured it well there. And get us on schedule here. A number of things on the regulatory side that we want to cover and give you a heads up on. This one you should all be aware of since we've mentioned it multiple times in the last year, but it is now finally upon us. Effective January 1st, your 300As, your 301s, your 300s, you have to file them electronically. There's been a change. It's no longer those with just 250 or more that have some requirements. Now that if you had 100 or more employees at any time during 2023, you'll be required to e-file your 300s and your 301s. So that's something new. Again, you still have to post in your shops, your 300 As, but here's your link below on how to be able to do that. And you must, again, reminder, this is an annual rule since the Obama administration. March 2nd is the deadline to have that done. Also, keep in mind, if you have not done this before, it will take several days likely, or at least some time to set up a username and get yourself enrolled in the system. This is going way back to the days of George W. Bush when we were working on association health plans. President Trump tried to bring them back to some extent. And then upon coming in, there were some changes. Obviously, with the Biden administration does not support small businesses coming together to be able to pool their resources to purchase healthcare for a number of reasons. So this is the final nail in that coffin where they're going to rescind the vacated association health plan regulation that's out there. I know there were many of us that worked on this for many, many years. So at least for now, that is gone. Beneficial ownership reporting. For those of you, if you'll look at the right-hand side of the screen for eligibility, if you have 20 or fewer employees and 5 million or less in revenue, which some of our members do, there's a new reporting requirement that was signed into law in December of 2020, part of the Corporate Transparency Act, called beneficial ownership reporting. You're going to have to fill out for individual owners that have some kind of either at least 25% control or some kind of decision making, hiring, firing, where you put your investments, etc. Those individuals must all be listed, and that report has to be filed with FinCEN. You have to put their names, date of birth, addresses, and a copy of their driver's license or some kind of identification. It has to be submitted by January of 2025. Before you go ahead and submit on this is law, but we did just have an overwhelmingly 400+ vote bill get through the House a few weeks ago that would try to extend this deadline by 1 year, but the legislation, even if it does get through the Senate, would not eliminate the requirement. But just keep this in mind that if you are in that time, in that size frame, that you will have some additional reporting requirements at some point this calendar year. This slide here is as much a call to action for some of you all that have been very active within within the world of workforce development, training, and apprenticeships in particular. We could use some assistance here. We have 779 pages of a proposed rule that came out on December 14th from the U.S. Department of Labor. We'll give you a couple of the positives in here, and then we'll raise some of the flags. There is a call on the 11th, I believe it is, of January, and a briefing with the Department of Labor to go over this and some of their proposals. Keep in mind, the National Apprenticeship Act has not been updated since 1937, and this is the administration's effort to effectively go around Congress or prompt Congress to act, depending on your read, since legislation to reauthorize that apprenticeship law has floundered on Capitol Hill now for a couple of years. What they do create here is a student specific, so for 16, 17, and I guess 18-year-olds technically as well, would create a apprenticeship program called Career and Technical Education Apprenticeships. For some of you, we've spoken to about this over the years. Some of you already have a similar program where you've gone through your state and you've worked with that student's education organization to get some kind of a letter, and you've got a curriculum or a program that they're in, and they can come be an apprenticeship with you while still being in high school. Well, the Department of Labor is looking at trying to formalize that a little bit more by creating these career and technical education apprenticeships, registered CTE apprenticeships. They'll create here. You'll notice on some of the requirements with regard to their OJT, they want to have a minimum of 540 hours of CTE apprenticeship related instruction with no less than 12 post-secondary credit hours. There's quite a bit in here when it goes into the creation of CTE. Some of you that might be following here and watching the webinar will look right above it, and you'll notice that the no less than average of 144 hours per 2,000 hours of OJT training. That is something that is going to be addressed here on the next slide, but it's important to note that they are trying to create these registered CTE apprenticeships, and that's something that we could probably see some of our members getting behind in certain locations, especially if you've already gone through your state to some extent with regards to that. They do also have a reciprocity provision that's not listed on this slide, but what they are trying to do is force the states to where there's been a federal program for apprenticeship recognized, and the state would then also take it as well. And that would be a way where you could kind of streamline the portability of your apprenticeships across state lines, and for you employers to make it easier for you to hire somebody that might be recognized at the federal level, but your state hasn't been fully in there. So that reciprocity language does appear in that 700+ page rule. They also are, most importantly here, looking to move it over to a time-based model for apprenticeships, whereas a number of years ago, we and others had lobbied to move in 2008, I think it was, to a competency time or a combination of competency plus time-based apprenticeship programs. And this proposed rule by initial reads would then mandate the 2,000 hours of the on-the-job training plus the 144 of classroom hours there is what they want to see for the apprenticeships. And keep in mind, there's another, this pay scales, all those continue to increase, and there's a number of other requirements that are in here. Some of you might have seen the Wall Street Journal editorial talking about bathroom requirements, a number of other things that are there as well. And so this is something to keep in mind, that if they do move this rule through, there will be quite a bit of changes that are involved in the apprenticeship programs. There will be public comments are due in February. So NTMA and PMA will certainly be filing comments, and would welcome your input and your support and getting those comments filed at some point in there as well. One other thing that we want to just touch base on the regulatory agenda that we wanted to put out there. This is more forward looking. Twice a year, the federal government agencies are required to put out their list of notice of proposed rulemakings and their final rules that they plan on issuing in the coming 12 months just before Christmas. The Unified Regulatory Agenda for the fall 2023 was released by the Biden administration. It has 2,524 entries of proposed and final rules listed. We went through those and we narrowed it down to about 64 or so rules that we are tracking for both the NTMA and the PMA. Quick update, we don't have an exact firm timeline based on that regulatory agenda for the OSHA heat rule, but they are looking at analyzing comments during this January period, which potentially might put them on course to release some kind of a rule later in the spring. The National Labor Relations Board on the union election rule, which would expedite the union process for when they do deem to hold an election. That final rule is coming out in March. And that is as expected. We'd heard those rumors previously as well. For those on the emissions duty side, also in March is the light and medium duty vehicles on the emissions for the emissions coming out for the MY 2027, the model year 2027 and later. So they call this more of the long-term view of it, so know that any changes and requirements would also likely have to mean a re-election of President Biden for most of these to go through, to keep that in mind, especially if they're on the longer term agenda as well. Similar with the passenger vehicles and the light trucks standard is also coming in April of 2024 according to the agenda. That's how you read these on the bottom left. It'll say if it's a final rule, an NPRM means a notice of proposed rulemaking, which as you can see is a step before the final rule. That's how you get to that one. Sticking with the climate issues, the Securities and Exchange Commission, this one has received a lot of attention about the climate disclosure issues. I know the folks over at Bracewell are real experts on this. April of 2024 is also the timeline for the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to release that one. A couple of more here. And the April of 2024 also has another one on overtime pay and expansion. This rule, John and I have brought up a number of times in September and October and in November, when the Department of Labor proposed increasing it from the current threshold of $35,568 for salaried annual executive, administrative, professional, and clerical employees. They're proposing to increase the time and a half for those full-time salaried, for making them eligible from 35,568 to taking it up after the rule goes through. Sometime it could be as high as over 60,000, which would make over 3.6 million more workers eligible for time and a half pay. That final rule scheduled to be released in April of 2024. There's also a highly compensated level where they're going to increase that threshold from around 107,000 to 143,988. The initial rule they put out a few months ago said it would take effect 60 days upon final publication of the final rule, which means this could take effect sometime next summer, and to factor that in mind. The last one on the agenda, looking forward through the calendar year, is lockout tagout. This one had been delayed from July of 2023, and it's not off the list. It's now a notice of proposed rulemaking. That's the step before the issue of final rule, and both associations have been involved in that process for a number of years, going back to the Obama days. So we will continue to look out for that. There's again 64 we've identified out of over 2,500 on the regulatory agenda, and both internally here, we've got a more comprehensive list of regulations. Would you care to see those? A few items on the IRS side to make you aware of that they released a number of information here just around the holidays, as tends to happen. The employee retention credit, this is hopefully the last time we talk about this. We think we've beaten this one enough, but the IRS has given folks yet another out if they believe they should not have claimed the employee retention tax credit that was created during the COVID days. And they're giving you another out in terms of what you can do with the new voluntary disclosure program in order to pay back the money that was received after a claim was filed in error. And they also mailed out 20,000 denial letters to claimants back in December. So that's something also to talk about with your practitioners if that is an area of concern that's out there. This is just general use. Someone hopefully will tell you this, but please just let somebody in your shop know. The IRS did increase the mileage rate to 67 cents per mile. That's up 1.5 cents from 2023. And that also affects your vans, your pickups, and your panel trucks for those that do have such vehicles as well. Next 3 or 4 slides here are more concentrated on the Inflation Reduction Act. That was the president and Democrats up on Capitol Hill signed into law a couple of years ago. And the IRS has updated the electric vehicle tax credit. FAQs, keep in mind there's 2 different EV tax credits. There's one for commercial vehicles and there's another one for the regular public, and this is one for the regular public. And this is also the one that's received the most attention with the January 1 effective date with an interpretation. If you look at this from the inverse, if you are in this industry and you're manufacturing a product for a BEV, then this will affect you because they took down the number of eligible vehicles quite significantly from somewhere around 40, 43, depends on your read, down to 19. As you can see, if a vehicle has any battery components that were manufactured or assembled by a foreign entity of concern, which is Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, then, meaning China, if that's where you need to read, then the vehicle is no longer considered a new clean vehicle and therefore not eligible for the partial new clean vehicle credit of $33,750. That's something to factor in, as that wiped out quite a few vehicles when that tightening, after a lot of criticism that the Biden administration received over some of the lax ways that the regulations were interpreted based on the law was written. And that brought down the full qualifying for the full credit down to 19. You can go to a fueleconomy.gov website, and that's where you can go in now, and you can literally, what you'll see on this drop screen, if you were to scroll down, you'd be able to see all the different models that are currently eligible and the amount that they're eligible for. And that's one of the main changes. This website's been around for a while, but the new credit, that update came out on January 1st, although with the change that consumers can directly just swap that credit out at with the dealer, and the dealer will just take care of it later. That's on the passenger vehicle side. The IRS did on December 20th also issue on the commercial electric vehicle notice on 45W. That's where the different parts of the tax credits are there, and additional guidance providing safe harbor for certain qualified commercial clean vehicles that are being placed into service here in 2024 with regards to their weight, their gross vehicle weight. So again, something here to talk to the folks that are managing your fleet, along with who's doing purchasing for the coming year, and especially in consultation with your CPA and your CFOs with regards to the commercial vehicles, as certainly some of you are likely going to have that and be eligible for 45W. This one ended up coming out in early days a lot tighter than we'd like, and now a little bit more looser on 45X, the manufacturing production credit, with regards to sales on eligible components, mostly on solar and wind and battery, and another number of those cells as photo cells as well. And some of what they ended up saying is that with regards to the credit, it clarifies that the elements of materials and subcomponents going into the production of those eligible for the credit don't have to have a domestic production rule. That's something we're going to be speaking to a number of our partners here in town, since this is still a proposed rule and there's still time to file some comments on it. So we'll be reaching out to some groups and seeing what can be done, especially since some of our members would want to be included as some of those downstream components that would make then their customers eligible, were they included for that as well. Just rounding it out here, we'll hand it over to Bracewell in a few slides, but just talking about some of the supply chains, some quick numbers that we've seen. Obviously, you saw recently the unemployment numbers that came out earlier this morning on Friday, on January 5th here. But here's also the JOLTS numbers, jobs, openings, lost, transitions, and separations that we take a look at every month. Durable goods, you're seeing that the number of job openings has increased by about 20,000 in November 2023 over the previous month reading, and then quite down significantly since November of 2022. And most of you have seen the economic data there. However, the investment in manufacturing plant construction, albeit largely driven by a lot of the chip spending, continues to increase, which does ultimately bode well, at least for domestic investment, onshoring and reshoring. To that effect, we found this interesting in Financial Times, so we thought we would share it, that China's CNC machine tool exports are significantly increasing. They're increasing, however, going over to Russia, and you can all take a look at some of the issues there with regards to what you can expect, but also the way that you may want to look at it is as the Chinese ramp up some of their capacities at some point, if the Russians stop buying some of those machine tools from China, will look to go elsewhere, and that could have further implications on the industry. So we felt it interesting to include that one as well. A few things on China before we turn it over to Paul and go over some of the metals markets there. We all are aware by now that we still do have the tariffs in place, the Section 301 tariffs on about 10,000 imports coming in from China, 25% and 7.5%. A few things have happened there. There are still some exclusions in place. Those are a place where you do not have to pay the tariffs for a certain period of time. There's only 429 left. 77 of them are COVID specific. The other 352 are a wide range, everything from engines to chemicals under Chapters 39, and then a few others under machinery under Chapter 84, and a few other parts of again, other electrical and lots of fabric and woven that's in there as well. Those have been extended until May 31st, and there's a public comment period. None of them shouldn't say none. They, for the most part, do not affect the HTS numbers on which we focus, although could affect somewhere in the supply chain related to you. Of note as well, we still do not have a Section 301 report from the U.S. Trade Representative. It's the 4-year report that's been required, although we are starting to hear that sometime in the next few weeks, they may issue some additional notice on their findings with regards to what to do on the tariffs on China, including possibly expanding to additional electric vehicles from China and other BEV materials, while also possibly lifting some on consumer goods. Same thing we've been hearing since last summer now, but maybe they're actually getting closer. Lastly, on China, the House Congressional Committee, with which John and I worked with for 2023, wrapped up most of its work at the end of the year by releasing a report with nearly 150 recommendations. And those recommendations covered 3 different categories in what they call pillars. In those 3 pillars, they're calling it on the reset, the terms of the relationship with China, which is largely on the trade front, stem the flow of capital and technological fueling, that's the export import, and then the other one is trying to build up with allies. Before we get to the next slide on this one, on pillar 3, it is of note that among those recommendations are to lay the groundwork through legislation for free trade agreements with the UK, Japan, and Taiwan. They do single out those 3 specifically in their comments and in their recommendations. Again, still a long ways. Biden hasn't shown interest in wanting that, and you can expect all the obvious things on many of the export controls that are put in there, but many are interpreting the recommendations under Pillar 1 to mean withdrawing permanent normal trade relations status for China, which would basically mean most favored nation status granted upon accession of the WTO in 2000. And what that would mean is an act of Congress that would be required to remove that PNTR status. That would be difficult. That language apparently was watered down based on conversations our firm had with people working on this. But what this proposal would do, and again, it's a proposal, would take an act of Congress, would be create a special category. There's 2 columns right now. There's Schedule 1, Column 1, where you can have reduced duties of 2 to 5%. And then there's the Column 2, which is where you have North Korea and Cuba and some of those that are out there for the higher tariff rates. What they're looking at doing is creating a separate category just for China. And so that, again, would be pretty significant. We are hearing there could be a China bill some point this year, but know that there's increasing pressure in Washington to do something with regards to trade relations in China on there. But Paul, to that point, with regards to trade relations, we know the Biden administration tried to reach a deal, really couldn't, so we're getting more of the same.
Yeah, as we've been reporting on several of these webinars, the EU and the US were in protracted negotiations regarding the tariff rate quotas that were put in place by the Biden administration to replace the Section 232 tariffs. That deal only was for 1 year, where both sides were supposed to negotiate, or the US was pushing for a Green Steel Club where they would have tiers of tariffs for those who produced steel and aluminum with high carbon emissions, i.e. China, and another level for others who are in the club. The EU was very hesitant on doing this. Throughout the fall, there were reports that progress was being made, false reports of the EU agreeing to also undertake tariff rate quotas. In the end, top EU officials visited in October, where they were going to announce the deal, but they could not reach a deal. So what they said is they were going to keep talking. So you have the US announcing in late December officially that they are just going to keep the tariff rate quotas on the EU for 2 more years while they continue to negotiate. And then the EU made an announcement that they have agreed not to retaliate, because as you recall that there was $6 billion in retaliation against US exports that the EU was threatening to impose. They have agreed not to impose any retaliatory tariffs and to keep the TRQs until now. There's a little bit difference in dates. The EU only extends it till March 25th, so that will be interesting to take a look at. So that conflict has been now put aside.
Well, Paul, some color commentary, and you know why the Europeans went to March 25th instead of a full year through there. They're obviously looking forward to the U.S. election and I shouldn't say looking forward, but they're looking at the U.S. election and seeing what the outcomes may be, and where 1 year from now, are they dealing with a Trump or are they dealing with a Biden?
Correct. Exactly. So, the EU, after a lot of threats, basically we're at the status quo, at least until March 2025. We will keep an eye on that. Meanwhile, as you know, U.S. Steel was announced that they have a deal to be acquired by Japan-based Nippon Steel. That happened over the holidays, that announcement, and that generated a lot of concern on Capitol Hill by steel state members of Congress. There's a lot of calls for the U.S. to conduct a CFIUS review about the national security implications of a Japanese company owning U.S. Steel. I know Cleveland Cliffs testified this week urging a CFIUS review. There's a lot of noise being made. It's still unclear whether that noise is going to turn into a serious. President Biden even encouraged the CFIUS review. While there's not indications that the deal won't go through yet, there's still a lot to be negotiated, and we'll see what happens. Obviously, another question that I have been raising is if we have national security tariffs on Japanese steel, well, we have tariff rate quotas on Japanese exports to the United States, but it's okay for a Japanese company to buy a US company. My point is not that opposed to a Japanese company buying US steel. My point is kind of silly to have national security, quote, national security, unquote, tariffs on Japan. So it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out on Capitol Hill. Obviously, a lot of these members of Congress have put a lot into supporting the Section 232 steel tariffs under Trump and Biden, and now they feel kind of betrayed that U.S. Steel just used that protection to, to better prepare for sale to a Japanese company. So it's a lot of interesting politics going on. Just an update, this is the Steel Benchmarker report that comes out twice a month. As you can see, the gap between U.S. hot rolled steel prices and China prices is as wide as it's been and growing in a while. And also the EU, the gray line there, that gap is growing, that U.S. prices rise. And as we all know, that price that is paid by your competitors overseas for steel versus the price that you pay here in the States is very important. So we keep a close track on that. So I wanted to start the year, and since we have such a large crowd, to encourage NTMA and PMA members to participate in our One Voice activities through helping with talking to reporters. It's a great way to promote your company. We would only put you in situations where it's a positive report or you're providing important information. As you can see from the issues that Omar and John have covered, there's a wide variety of issues that you can speak upon. Also, if you're doing something cool and you've got some innovative program that you want to promote, that, whether it's a workforce program or something else, let us know. The best way to register to be a media volunteer is through your associations, and we will add you to the media volunteers list. What we do is we send out a note, we BCC everybody and say, hey, the Wall Street Journal is writing on manufacturing this issue, and if you're interested in talking, they're looking for somebody to talk to. We always give you a deadline, what the issue is, and if you're interested, you just send us a reply, and then we tell you more about it. And if you're comfortable doing it and you want to do it, then we set up the interview. We can participate in the interview with you, and we could also offer a brief prep session on points to emphasize and some tricks of the trade. So we always are looking for more media volunteers. We continue to get a great number of media requests, and they're growing. And it's a great way not only to promote your company, but also to help Omar and John on Capitol Hill, and also to promote PMA and NTMA.
If you haven't already, check out the new One Voice website. If you notice at the start of the webinar, you saw the new One Voice logo. You can see that in the upper left corner of this screenshot of the website here on this slide. This new logo, new website is a product of the work of the government affairs team from both NTMA and PMA. It is a much more modern, sort of refreshed take on the current or on the pre-existing logo and website. And in addition, will be, I think, a powerful resource for all NTMA and PMA members who are looking for advocacy content, particularly as we head into an election year. You can find the new website online at onevoiceinfo.org. That's the same URL we've been pushing you to for years. The new website is live there now. So onevoiceinfo.org, you can find it there. And tune into our podcast. If you liked today's content, or maybe you want to hear a little bit more politics, because we do some more politics in addition to policy on the podcast, you can find that podcast anywhere you get podcasts. So Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you like to find your podcast content. It's Talking with One Voice is the name of the show. It features everybody that you heard on today's webinar. If you're already listening, that's great. Thank you for that. Subscribe to the show so that the new episodes automatically download to your device, and leave us a rating or review to help other people find the show.
Thanks all. And as always, please support NTMA and PMA's advocacy efforts here in Washington, D.C. It's how it makes programming like this possible and keeps our efforts going. It's going to be a very, very busy 2024. If you have any questions, please type them into the box on the right-hand side. We're happy to just stick around here for another moment, as we covered quite a bit on taxes, on regulations coming forward. And next month, we will try to get back closer to the 30-minute mark. There was just always quite a bit coming out here at the end of the year on regulations, as there is every year. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in, or you can reach out to any one of us, or Jenny at NTMA or Christy at PMA with anything that you all need. Please fill out that survey. It is critical. We're going to do one more reminder. You should look at somebody in your shop should look at an inbox that came in from One Voice NTMA PMA is the way it'll come in, and it would have come in this past Wednesday, January 3rd. We'll be sending out another reminder on this coming week, either on Tuesday and Wednesday. Please help get our numbers up. It adds to our credibility when we're on Capitol Hill. We will, as always, be sending out a copy of this webinar in a PDF format in a couple of hours, along with the recording of this program. We will also have the webinar be uploaded to onevoiceinfo.org website that Caitlin just mentioned on one of the tabs that's out there. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate your time today, and enjoy the weekend.